The attic was never meant to be explored. It was a place of dust and low rafters, where light came in fractured, spilling through warped boards in thin, cold ribbons. In the winter of 1911, decades after the event that had quietly broken a family, the attic's air was as stale as the breath of something long sealed away. Anna Moore was not looking for anything in particular that day. She had returned to Hartwell, Vermont, from Boston, the first time in nearly 20 years. The house had been left to her after her father's death, a house that had once been alive with the muffled sounds of wood stoves and the slow ticking of a mantel clock. Now it smelled of cedar and disuse. She wandered through each room as if cataloguing ghosts, pausing at the door to the attic for far longer than she should have. The stairs were narrow, the kind you climbed sideways. The wood groaned under her weight, as if reluctant to remember. At the top, she found the familiar shapes, trunks her mother had called, not worth opening, a cradle with one slat missing, stacks of mildewed hymnals. But it was the small cedar chest in the far corner that drew her, a chest she recognized instantly even though she hadn't seen it since she was 14. Its brass latch stuck a little, but when it finally gave, the smell of old paper rose like a faint exhalation. Inside, beneath a layer of folded clothes she remembered her mother sewing by lamplight, lay a stack of sketchbooks bound with twine. She pulled the top one free. The paper was brittle at the edges, the pencil strokes faded but careful, deliberate. The first few pages were harmless enough, a weathered barn in winter, the pale arc of the frozen pond, a schoolhouse window framed with frost. But as she turned the pages, the drawings began to shift. Shadows took on shapes they shouldn't have. The snow in some scenes was no longer still but swirling, suffocating, alive. And then she saw it. The last sketch. It was not large, just a page torn slightly at one corner, but the image seemed impossibly deep, as if the pencil had dug its way into another world. In the center was a small boy, no more than 12, trudging through an endless blizzard. His shoulders were hunched, his scarf whipping sideways in the wind. Snow rose around him in great white walls, erasing the horizon. The strokes were fierce yet precise, every line charged with a strange, knowing energy. And in the bottom corner, in the same neat hand that had drawn it, was a date, January 15, 1875. Anna's breath caught. That was 3 years after the drawing had been made. She knew this because the boy in the sketch was her younger brother, Elias. And January 15, 1875, was the day he vanished. She sat there in the dim attic light, the drawing trembling slightly in her hands. Memories she had learned to bury stirred and pushed against her ribs, the smell of wood smoke on Elias's coat, the way his fingers always seemed smudged with graphite, the faint, far-off look in his eyes when he sketched. She remembered, too, how the grown-ups never spoke of that day without lowering their voices, if they spoke of it at all. The blizzard in the drawing was no invention. Anna had seen it herself, the way it swallowed the world whole. And now, staring at her brother's face rendered in delicate pencil lines, she realized something she had not dared consider as a child: Elias had drawn his own disappearance years before it happened. The attic seemed colder then. Dust motes drifted in the beam of light from the one small window, their slow fall making the air feel heavy. Anna closed the sketchbook carefully, almost reverently, as if she were closing the lid on a coffin. She wanted to leave it there, let the years reclaim it, but she couldn't. She slipped the sketchbook under her arm, feeling the weight of it, and the weight of the story it carried. Outside, the snow had begun to fall, just as it had on that day in 1875. The sky was a pale, blank slate, the kind Elias might have loved to capture on paper. Anna stood at the window for a long time, the sketchbook pressed against her chest, and for a moment she thought she saw a figure far out on the road, a small figure, walking away into the white. The thought came unbidden, cold and clear: some roads you walk only once, but they never stop existing. This was not the first time the drawing had been found. Rumor in Hartwell held that it had surfaced twice before, once when the house was being repaired after a chimney fire, and again when a neighbor's child had been sent to fetch sewing thread from the attic. Each time, it vanished again without explanation, as if retreating back into the shadows between beams and rafters. The old women in town called it, the page that walks in the snow, though they never said it in front of outsiders. Anna did not yet know what she would do with it, whether she would burn it, keep it, or lock it away. All she knew was that opening that cedar chest had undone something in her, a seal she had placed long ago over that day and its silence. The snow was falling harder now, the wind low and steady. Somewhere outside, a door slammed, and for an instant she thought she heard a boy's footsteps running past, the soft crunch of boots in fresh powder. But when she looked, the road was empty. Only the snow moved, weaving slow white curtains across the land, erasing the edges of things. In that moment, she understood what the drawing had always been, not a warning, not even a memory, but a map. And she was holding it again, after all these years, as if it had been waiting for her. A town on the edge of the map, 1,050 words Hartwell, Vermont, in the winter of 1872 was the kind of place you did not find unless you meant to. It clung to the edge of the Green Mountains like a stubborn pine, its single main road curling away into forests that swallowed the world beyond. The nearest railway station was 2 days by sleigh when the snow was kind, and unreachable when it wasn't. For most of a year, Hartwell lived in a rhythm that made sense only to itself, planting in the thaw, haying in the gold of late summer, and then waiting out the long, unbroken silence of winter. The town had no grand architecture, only what necessity had built. The church, whitewashed and plain, stood at the crossroads, its bell rope worn smooth by decades of Sunday tolls. The schoolhouse was little more than one room with a black stove at its center, its stovepipe coughing black smoke on cold mornings. And then there were the houses, squat farmhouses, their clapboard siding gray with age, their windows glowing like lanterns in the blue dark of January. Snow in Hartwell was not the soft, storybook kind. It came heavy, relentless, pushing up against doorframes, sealing barns, bending fences until they creaked. At night, the wind carried a hollow note through the valleys, a sound that made you think of distant oceans even though there were none for hundreds of miles. The townsfolk, hardy, practical, bound by necessity, had long learned not to waste words on superstition. Still, you could feel it, in the way they closed shutters early, in the way they spoke of the woods as though it listened. It was into this world that Elias Moore had been born. His father, Samuel, was a man of few words, his face lined not with age so much as with the habit of squinting into wind and snow. He worked the family's small holding of cattle and hay, and though the farm yielded little in the way of money, it kept them fed. His mother, Martha, was different, her voice quick, her faith quicker. She kept the family's Bible open on the table, its pages so worn they felt almost like cloth, and she had a way of looking at her children as if she were both proud of and afraid for them. Anna was the elder by 6 years, practical even as a girl. She knew how to gut a fish, patch a roof shingle, and recite the catechism without stumbling. Elias, by contrast, seemed always to be elsewhere. Not lazy, never lazy, but his attention drifted like smoke, pulled toward things unseen. He was most often found with a piece of charcoal or a pencil in his hand, leaning over scraps of paper salvaged from old account books. If he wasn't drawing, he was staring, at the sky, at the slow rise of fog from the river, at the way frost feathered across the window panes in the morning. In a town like Hartwell, boys were expected to be part of the machinery of survival. They fetched water, chopped wood, tended animals. Elias did his share, but his hands moved reluctantly on those tasks, his mind elsewhere. More than once, Samuel was heard to mutter, "That boy's head is full of clouds," though never where Elias could hear. Martha, on the other hand, seemed to guard some unspoken sympathy for her son's quiet strangeness. She would save paper scraps for him, wrapping them in cloth to keep them from curling, as if preserving something delicate. The town's other children regarded Elias with a mixture of curiosity and mild unease. He was not unfriendly, but his silences were long and his eyes often fixed on something no one else could see. If you sat beside him in the schoolhouse, you might catch him sketching the teacher's face, but somehow the eyes in the drawing would look older, as if they had seen something far beyond Hartwell's frozen fields. That winter, the snow had come early and hard. By late November, the road to the nearest store was little more than 2 narrow ruts cut into a white expanse. Nights were long, 15 hours of darkness broken only by the blue flicker of lantern light through frost. In the evenings, families gathered around their stoves, the heat barely holding against the cold that pressed at the walls. In the Moore household, Elias would often sit at the edge of the table, sketchbook open, the sound of his pencil scratching faintly under the hum of the wind outside. It was during these months that Hartwell's few diversions became important. Sundays brought the only communal gathering of the week. The church pews filled with families stamped free of snow, their cheeks flushed from the cold. Pastor Ellsworth's sermons were stern but not unkind, laced with the belief that isolation was a test of the soul. After service, people lingered in the churchyard, their breath clouding in the air, exchanging small news: a cow calving early, a neighbor's chimney repaired, a fox sighted near the mill stream. But beneath the surface of such conversations lay the subtle politics of a small, sealed world. Everyone knew everyone's business, and deviation from the accepted order was noted, quietly, and remembered. Elias's drawings were one such deviation. Though admired for their skill, they were also, to some, unsettling. A boy could draw the woods, yes, but why must he draw them at dusk, with the shadows deeper than they should be? Why did the faces in his portraits look so serious, even when the subjects had been smiling? For now, no one spoke these thoughts aloud, but they lingered. And in a place like Hartwell, lingering thoughts had a way of growing heavier in the long dark of winter. The Moores themselves lived on the north edge of town, their farmhouse set a little apart from the others. Behind it stretched a line of bare elms and then the woods, thick and dark even under snow. A narrow track wound through those woods to the frozen pond, where children skated on clear days. Elias skated rarely, preferring instead to kneel at the bank with his sketchbook, drawing the way ice fractured under shifting light. By the time December gave way to January, the days had grown so short that dawn and dusk seemed to merge. On some afternoons, it was difficult to tell if the sun had risen at all. In such light, Hartwell seemed more shadow than substance, its edges blurred by snow and wind. It was in this season, and in this strange suspended light, that the story of Elias's final sketch, and the date inscribed upon it, would begin to take shape. For now, the boy was simply another quiet figure in a quiet town, his head bent over a page, his pencil whispering lines that no one yet understood. It started with birds. Elias sat on the step with a stub of pencil and traced the quick, jerking bodies of sparrows along the fence rail, catching the tilt of their heads as they listened for seeds beneath crusted snow. His lines were nimble, the work of a boy who loved looking more than speaking. At first, everything he drew belonged to the small world within reach: oxen steaming in the yard, the schoolhouse window furred with frost, the twist of rope on the well's handle, his sister's hands cupping a candle flame to coax it into steadiness. The drawings were careful, plain, the kind of work that elicited a nod from a father, a soft smile from a mother. The pages smelled faintly of coal smoke and winter cloth. They were the proof of a quiet boy doing something gentle with his hours. Then, almost without anyone noticing, the drawings deepened. Shadows pooled differently. Snow stopped being merely white and became layered, a kind of weathered skin with muscles and moods. He drew the road to the pond as if it had weight, a slow white tendon curving toward the woods. On one page, a sleigh bell lay half buried in a drift, a tiny dark circle in a field of pale graphite. You could almost hear its silence. Even Miss Cartwright, who was not easily moved, held that page a little longer than the rest, as if warmth might rise from it. She kept a box of paper scraps beneath her desk, torn exercises, the blank halves of spent notices, anything that could be written on twice. Soon she began saving the better pieces for Elias, not to encourage him, exactly, but because she could not bear to see those hands waste themselves on the backs of old receipts. Once she found him sketching only the stove's shadow, not the stove, and somehow the shadow looked warmer than the iron it came from. When she raised the sheet to the window, the drawing seemed to drink the winter light and keep it, as if light trusted the paper more than the room. Around that time, the first symbol appeared. In the lower right of a landscape, a stand of birches with bark rendered like peeled ribbon, rested a tiny mark, 3 short lines joined at the base, a blunt trident. It might have been accident. Yet in the next drawing it returned, tucked along a barn eave like a nail. On another it hid in fence knots. Always small. Always present. Elias did not sign his name, the mark did that for him, discreetly and without asking permission. When Anna asked him about it, he shrugged, not evasive so much as untroubled. It shows the way, he said, as if that answered everything. He did not say where the way led. At first the town took pride in him. Parents asked whether the Moore boy might sketch their teams, their houses, their dogs. He obliged with a shy seriousness that made adults smile. Yet even the friendliest pages carried something off-center. Dogs stared past their owners into a distance the paper would not show. Smoke from chimneys did not rise, it leaned, drawn toward a weight beyond the edge. The more he drew, the more he listened. That was how Anna thought of it, listening, not looking. He would tilt his head as if a far-off pressure had reached him. His pencil moved faster, lines tightening, and afterward he seemed relieved, like someone who had delivered a difficult message. On a December afternoon the sky fell into grainy snow, and Miss Cartwright dismissed class early. A few children lingered, tugging on mittens. Elias stayed to gather slates. When he reached for the eraser he paused, studying the chalkboard. In the corner, the date had smudged into a gray cloud. With the side of his hand he dragged the smear into a tiny figure walking under falling flakes. "That's the right size," he murmured, as if measuring absence. She wiped it away quickly, startled by how alone a smudge could look. After New Year's the pages altered again. Depth crept in where it hadn't been, a small vertigo that made the flat surface feel like a window. Elias drew the river under ice, the black water showing through a narrow throat where current kept a channel open. He caught the fine web of stress lines skittering across the glaze and, within them, the trident threaded like a stitch. On the next page the mark multiplied, smaller each time, scattered like seed along an invisible path that led away from the viewer and into a whiteness so patient it felt like time. On a Sunday evening Martha set a plate of molasses cookies on the table and asked to see the sketchbook. He nodded. She turned to a page where the schoolhouse sat beneath a sky of graphite polished with a rag. In each window he had drawn a faint reflection, not of children but of trees, a forest where the room should be. "Why the trees inside?" she asked softly. "So they won't be alone," he said. He was 11 and a half. He spoke as if explaining the weather, certain and distant, with a knowledge borrowed from the sky. Fewer people entered his scenes as winter deepened. When they appeared, they came at odd angles, from behind, from a distance, as silhouettes against snow. Faces softened into suggestion. Hands, however, he rendered with alarming care, tendons taut, nails shaded, knuckles burnished by cold. Miss Cartwright nearly brought the pages to the pastor, then decided spoken worry would drive the boy deeper into whatever country he had begun to map. She put the drawings back in her desk and, without quite noticing, prayed the smallest prayer she knew for travelers. In mid-January a small accident gave the drawings a new whisper. A sleigh overturned at the bend by the mill, spilling lantern chimneys that shattered across the road. No one was hurt, but glass glittered in slush like sugar. 2 days earlier, Elias had given Anna a drawing of that bend, the leaning birch, the ruts unmistakable, and in the foreground lay tiny shards half sunk in snow. "You saw them today," Anna teased. He shook his head. "Not today." The story moved through Hartwell with laughter that ended in glances. People here knew better than to bake omens out of ordinary bread. Still, they kept the slice. The following week a chimney fire blackened the Thompson house, and a page surfaced in Elias's book showing an exterior wall smoked into the grain days before. "He notices things," said the sensible. He notices too much, said the rest. By February the trident had migrated. It traveled into the skies of his pictures, tucked along cloud edges, floated in fields where no posts stood. On one unsettling page he sketched the pond under late snow, a dark oval of open water near the far bank, and the mark repeated across the ice like a path, 5, then 7, then 9, leading toward the hole. He counted them with a finger and stopped. That's as far as it goes, he said. Any farther and you fall through. That night Anna woke to a soft scratching and found him at the window, drawing by moonlight. The room was so cold her breath clouded. He did not turn when she spoke. After a moment he held up the page, an empty road under falling snow, drawn so delicately the flakes seemed to move. There's a turn here you can't see, he whispered. You only feel it once you've passed. People kept their distance from strangeness, as people do when strangeness wears a child's face. Yet the pages traveled, folded into pockets, passed at the store counter and the pump. The little trident became material for quiet jokes, then quiet dread. Some claimed they found it scratched in frost on barn windows. Others said it visited their dreams, 3 blunt lines pointing toward nothing and insisting nothing was a place. The last change that winter was the smallest and the worst. Dates began to appear, neat in the corners like nails driven through the paper. Elias had never dated his pages. Now a month and day shone in graphite, sometimes matching the present, sometimes not. One named a day not yet reached, anchoring a scene whose loneliness felt older than he was. Anna pressed her thumb to the numbers as if warmth could push them backward. The graphite did not smear. They did not know it, but the drawings had begun to carry time both ways, as if paper did not care which direction a moment traveled. Soon one date would arrive like weather, and the road from that number to its day, and from that day back to the page where it had waited, would open, quiet and patient, like a door cut into the white. By the winter of 1873, Elias had drawn enough to fill 3 worn sketchbooks. In the cramped desk drawers of the one-room schoolhouse, they lay tucked among slates and chalk, their spines soft from handling. The drawings traveled more than he did. A classmate would sneak one into a coat pocket and show it at supper, a farmhand would take one home to a mother who stared longer than she meant to. Before long, the boys' pages were seen in kitchens, barns, and store counters, each one carrying that quiet weight people couldn't name. The first whispers began with the older boys, those who chopped wood before dawn and spoke in low voices about things they'd half heard from their fathers. They claimed Elias didn't draw from memory, but from somewhere else entirely. He's not making it up, one said by the pump, eyes narrowing as if to keep the word small. He's copying. From where, no one could say. One frosted morning, while Miss Cartwright worked at the board, a ripple passed through the row of desks. Thomas Avery, who sat 2 benches behind Elias, leaned forward just enough to see what the boy was sketching. Later he told others he had seen not the usual trees or barns but a figure lying in snow, its outline blurred as though wind had taken it. The mark, that blunt trident, was pressed into the whiteness near the figure's head. And he wasn't even looking, Thomas swore. Just drawing and staring at nothing. By noon, the story had moved across the schoolyard, reshaped in each retelling. Some said the figure was faceless. Others insisted its eyes were open, looking straight at Elias from the page. Girls who usually traded ribbons kept their distance, their voices soft when he passed. Elias seemed not to notice, though Anna could see it in the way he lingered longer by the fence before joining the walk home. It wasn't only the children. Amos Pritchard, the mill hand who swept the school's porch when the snow got heavy, once stopped to watch Elias sketch between lessons. Later, over a mug of cider at the general store, he claimed he had recognized the scene, the riverbank near his own house, with a branch bent low from ice. 2 days afterward, the ice broke under his neighbor's sheepdog, who barely made it back to shore. "Tell me that's not the same bank," he said, tapping the counter with 2 fingers, but his voice carried the edge of someone who didn't want an answer. The whispers grew into a habit, like a draft you stop noticing until it touches your neck. Boys dared each other to look over Elias's shoulder, and girls traded scraps of his paper like charms. Even those who scoffed at omens began to feel a certain pause before turning a page he had touched. Miss Cartwright, though she never said it aloud, had begun keeping one eye on him as she taught. She noticed how his attention wandered to the windows, following not the other children but the light itself, tracking how it shifted across the snow outside. Once, she found a small square of paper left in the corner of the blackboard ledge, an open field under falling snow, the trident drawn only once, large and unhidden, in the center. She slipped it into her ledger without thinking why. At recess, Elias often stayed near the fence, drawing with his gloves off despite the bite in the air. A group of younger children once watched from a distance as he crouched to sketch the tracks of a hare leading toward the woods. Without looking up, he said, "They won't come back this way." The hare didn't, though a fox's tracks were found there 2 days later. The children told it in giggles at first, then in quieter tones when they realized no one could remember seeing the fox. Anna heard more than she wanted to on the walk home from school. Bits of talk drifted from behind, "He knew before it happened," and "My pa says he draws the future." She stopped turning around to answer. Instead, she would take Elias's hand and steer him toward the longer road, the one that curved away from the others. He never asked why. One day in late February, snow was falling so thick it blurred the treeline. Inside, the stove rattled from a gust pushing down the chimney. Elias bent over his book, shading the corner of a page until it deepened into something like a doorway. Thomas Avery, unable to resist, asked, "Where does it go?" Without lifting his pencil, Elias answered, "Where you can't come back the same." That answer followed Thomas into his sleep that night. He told no one in the morning, but by week's end, the schoolyard talk had shifted. The drawings were no longer just strange, they were dangerous in a way that didn't need explaining. Still, the boy kept sketching. And the trident kept appearing, in snowbanks, in the bend of a road, in the grain of a door, until it felt less like something added to the picture and more like something revealed. Those who saw it more than once began to feel the same, that the mark had been there all along, and Elias was only uncovering what was already waiting. By spring, when the thaw began and mud replaced snow, the whispers faded from words into glances. But they didn't vanish. In Hartwell, things like that never did. They simply went quiet, the way snow goes quiet before it starts to fall again. The drawing appeared without ceremony. Elias had been sitting at the kitchen table, the gray light of a late winter afternoon pressing through the small window. The stove gave off a low heat, just enough to keep the edge of the cold at bay. Anna was mending a tear in her shawl. Their mother was humming faintly, the sound more an act of habit than music. Elias, as he often did, worked with his head bent low, shoulders curled forward like a shield. It was only when Martha came to set the bread down that she saw the page. At first glance, it seemed like another of his winter scenes, a road narrowing into distance, lined with skeletal elms stripped bare by frost. The snow was rendered in strokes so soft it seemed to carry its own chill, drifting across the paper in faint arcs and swirls. But then her eyes caught the figure, small, solitary, walking into the heart of the storm. The shoulders were drawn forward, the scarf trailing in the wind, the head tilted as though listening to something in the whiteness. Even without a face, Martha recognized him. It was Elias. Her breath stalled as her gaze dropped to the lower corner. There, in his small, neat hand, was a date, January 15, 1875. She looked toward the window. Outside, the calendar said 1872. "You've written the wrong year," she said softly, as if the error could be undone with gentleness. Elias didn't look up. "It's not wrong," he said. His voice was neither defiant nor afraid, simply certain. Anna leaned over, curious, and the moment her eyes found the page she felt an unease bloom low in her stomach. It wasn't just that Elias had drawn himself. It was the way the snow seemed alive, folding over him, the way the road beyond his figure vanished into nothingness as though the world itself had run out of space. Martha set the bread down harder than she meant to. "Don't make pictures like that," she said, more quickly than she intended. "People don't need to see it." Elias's pencil paused above the paper. He didn't erase, didn't turn the page. "It's already true," he murmured. The drawing stayed on the table until Samuel came in from the barn. He stood in the doorway, brushing snow from his coat, his eyes narrowing when he saw what lay before them. He picked it up, studied it longer than his silence should have allowed, then set it back down. Without looking at his son, he said, "Don't show that one around." That night, after supper, Martha tried to remove the page from the book. But the pencil had pressed so deeply into the fibers that lifting it felt like peeling away skin. She let it be, sliding the sketchbook under a stack of folded linens in the cupboard. In the morning, it was back on the table. Elias sat beside it, shading the snowbanks darker, the edges sharper, as if the scene were still unfinished. Word of the drawing spread faster than they could contain it. Anna suspected Thomas Avery had glimpsed it through the kitchen window when he came to deliver a note from Miss Cartwright. By the week's end, Mrs. Avery stopped Anna after church. "That picture your brother made," she said quietly, "the one with the date, what's it supposed to mean?" Anna shook her head, feigning ignorance. "Just a snow scene," she said, but the lie sat heavy. In Hartwell, dates meant something. They marked harvests, storms, the day a child was born or a father was buried. To put a date on a thing was to tie it to time itself, and to place that time in the future, 3 years into the future, was to step into a space people didn't like to name. Some suggested the boy was making a joke, testing the town's appetite for mystery. Others felt the date like a splinter, lodged and waiting. No one said it aloud, but in a place where winter could take a man between one breath and the next, the idea of a marked day, a day chosen by a boy who seemed to see further than he should, had weight. Through it all, Elias carried on as if nothing had shifted. He drew the pond under moonlight, the church roof glistening with frost, the tracks of a fox crossing the road at dawn. But each page felt, somehow, like a step toward that storm on the marked date. The trident symbol appeared more often, sometimes pressed into the snow near a doorframe, sometimes drawn faint in the sky, as if the wind itself bore the mark. Anna asked him once, quietly, what he would be doing on that day in 1875. Elias didn't lift his head. "Walking," he said simply. "There's a place I have to go." And then, as if to close the matter, he turned the page. By early March of 1873, the drawing with the date had taken on a life of its own, though no one would admit to speaking of it openly. It traveled in whispers between pews after Sunday service, surfaced in the murmurs of women at the pump, and was folded into the pauses between men's talk at the store counter. The Moores had not shown it willingly, but in Hartwell, privacy was as porous as snow. Sooner or later, the wind found a way in. The first to speak against it in earnest was Pastor Ellsworth. One gray Sunday, his voice carried sharper than usual from the pulpit. He read from the book of James about the tongue being a small fire, capable of setting a great forest ablaze. He did not name Elias, but his gaze, steady and deliberate, settled more than once on the Moore pew. "There are visions that come from God," he said, "and there are visions that come from vanity, or worse. We must be careful not to mistake one for the other. Not all that is foreseen is meant to be drawn." Some nodded, glad for someone to pin their unease to Scripture. Others shifted uncomfortably. Elias was just a boy, after all, and no boy should be singled out in God's house. But the seed was planted. By the time the congregation filed out, the phrase, "visions from vanity," had been repeated enough times to feel like fact. The town doctor, Amos Lyman, was next. A practical man who prided himself on not being swayed by farm superstitions, he came to the Moore house one afternoon under the pretense of delivering a tonic for Martha's headaches. Sitting at the kitchen table, he leafed through Elias's older sketches with a faint frown. "You've a keen eye, lad," he said, tapping one of the pages. "But the mind can play tricks, especially in the long dark months. Dreams can slip into waking thought, and a boy might not know the difference. He spoke gently, as if explaining the matter to both child and parents alike. Best thing for him, Lyman said to Samuel afterward, is less time staring at paper and more time with the other boys, working his muscles, breathing the open air. Too much stillness breeds fancies. He did not mention that he had kept one of the drawings for himself, sliding it between the pages of his ledger without quite knowing why. Samuel tried, in his way, to follow the advice. He brought Elias into the barn for chores more often, handed him the mallet to crack ice in the troughs, set him to splitting wood. Elias did the work without complaint, but his eyes still wandered to the snow beyond the fences. Even as the handle of the axe rested in his hands, it seemed he was drawing something in his mind. At the general store, the talk turned to ways of steering the boy back to ordinary habits. Mr. Pritchard suggested sending him to stay with cousins in Rutland for a season. Mrs. Avery thought it best to forbid him paper and pencil altogether. Once it's out of his head, it'll fade, she said with a confidence that felt like wishful thinking. But Martha resisted. She did not defend the drawing with the date, that image unsettled her as much as anyone, but she would not have her son's gift treated like a sickness. The Lord gives what he gives, she told Anna in private. It's not for us to break it apart because we don't understand it. Yet even she began to close the curtains earlier, as though to keep the outside from looking in. The only person who seemed untouched by the gathering pressure was Elias himself. He neither flaunted nor hid his work. He still brought sketches to the table, though now they were of smaller things, a bird's footprint in mud, the curve of a chipped cup, the way frost climbed the inside of a windowpane. But even these felt like fragments of a larger whole, pieces that, when laid together, would form another of those scenes that seemed to stand outside of time. And always, the trident mark persisted. The pastor called it a needless flourish, the doctor called it a habit of the hand, but to those who looked too long at it, the symbol had a weight that pressed past reason. It was no longer tucked away in the corners. It appeared in the center of fields, in the lines of clouds, even carved into the surface of the road in one unsettling drawing. As March slid toward April, the wind in Hartwell took on that thin, restless quality that meant winter had not truly left. Even on clear days, it threaded through the streets with a sound like someone breathing behind you. Elias walked with his sketchbook under his arm, the leather strap tight, as though protecting it from more than just weather. There was one small incident that month which the town would later return to, sifting it for meaning. Elias was standing outside the schoolhouse at dismissal, sketching the line of the ridge against the sky. The wind rose suddenly, snapping at hats and scarves. Miss Cartwright called for the children to hurry, but Elias didn't move. He held the book open against the gust, his pencil working in short, quick strokes. When Anna caught up to him, she saw the page, the ridge, yes, but also a single figure walking its crest, coat flaring in the wind, the trident hovering just above like a weather sign. "Who is it?" she asked. He looked at the drawing as if surprised it was there. "It's not now," he said, and shut the book. Reason had been spoken. Explanations had been offered, neat and palatable. But against the wind that carried Elias's quiet certainty, they felt light, like paper held too loosely. The date remained. The drawing remained. And somewhere behind the talk of sermons and science, the town kept listening for the sound of snow beginning to fall. January 14, 1875 began like any other winter day in Hartwell, with the sun a pale coin behind thin clouds and a cold so deep it seemed to hum through the air. But by mid-afternoon, the wind had shifted, a low, steady push from the north, carrying with it a promise of heavier weather. Those who had lived long in the valley felt it in their bones. Curtains were drawn early. Barn doors were latched tight. Fires were fed more wood than usual, their crackle answering the groan of rafters under gathering frost. Inside the Moore farmhouse, supper was already on the table when Samuel came in from the barn, stamping the snow from his boots. "It'll be a bad one," he said simply, unwinding his scarf. "You'll want to bank the fire well tonight." Martha nodded, ladling stew into bowls, her eyes flicking once toward the window where the first thick flakes were beginning to fall. Elias was quieter than usual that evening. He ate slowly, his gaze resting not on his food but on the small frost halo around the window latch. Now and then he glanced toward the corner where his sketchbook lay closed, the strap wound twice around it. Anna noticed the way his fingers drummed lightly against his knee, as if measuring something neither of them could see. After supper, Samuel went to check the animals one last time before the storm made the barn a trial to reach. Martha settled by the stove with her mending. Anna gathered the dishes. Elias rose without a word, fetched the sketchbook, and sat at the table with a pencil already sharp in his hand. The sound of it scratching over paper was steady, unhurried, and oddly soothing against the distant moan of wind. Anna tried to peek at the page as she passed. He angled it away without looking up. "Not yet," he murmured. There was no mischief in his tone, only an odd formality, as if whatever he was drawing was not meant to be interrupted. By the time Samuel returned, snow was thick against the window panes. The oil lamp's flame trembled in the draft that slipped under the door. "That's enough drawing for tonight," he said, not unkindly. Elias gave a small nod and closed the book, though the pencil stayed in his hand. He stood by the stove for a moment, watching the flame as if trying to memorize its shape, then excused himself and climbed the narrow stairs to the bedroom he shared with Anna. She followed later, finding him sitting cross-legged on his bed, the sketchbook open on his lap. The lamplight pooled softly around him, leaving the corners of the room in shadow. "What is it?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know. He looked up briefly, his expression unreadable. "Just making sure it's finished," he said. Anna stepped closer. In the center of the page was the road beyond their farmhouse, stretching away into a snow that filled the sky. The figure on the road was small, shoulders bent, scarf streaming sideways in the wind. Around the edges, the flakes were drawn so delicately they seemed to move if you stared long enough. And there, near the lower corner, the date sat like an anchor, January 15, 1875. A small, sharp unease prickled the back of her neck. "You shouldn't," she began, but the words faltered. He closed the book and set it on the small table beside his bed. "It's all right," he said softly. "It's just the way it has to be." Outside, the wind deepened, pressing against the house with long, sighing gusts. Snow hissed against the glass. In the loft above the barn, the cattle shifted restlessly, their movements muffled through the walls. Samuel checked the stove one last time before turning in. Martha paused at the foot of the stairs to listen, her hand resting on the banister, as if weighing whether to go up and see her son. In the end, she didn't. Sometime in the night, Anna woke to a faint scratching sound. At first she thought it was the branches against the siding, but the rhythm was too precise. She opened her eyes to see Elias at the small desk under the window, pencil in hand, working by the silver wash of moonlight reflected off the snow outside. She started to speak, but something in his stillness kept her quiet. His hand moved quickly, the page filling with lines that grew darker near the center. Then he stopped, laid the pencil down, and closed the book with care. Without glancing at her, he returned to bed. "Go back to sleep," he whispered, though his tone held neither drowsiness nor command, only a quiet finality. Anna lay awake for a long while after, listening to the storm gather itself around the house, the walls creaking like an old ship in heavy seas. She drifted at last into uneasy dreams in which the road outside their house stretched on forever, swallowed in white, and the only sound was the faint, steady crunch of footsteps moving away. By morning, Elias's bed was empty. Dawn on January 15, 1875 arrived without light. The sky was the same pale gray as the snowdrifts, horizon blurred into a single sheet of cold. The wind had quieted, but the air carried that thick, muffled silence that follows a heavy night storm, when every sound feels slowed, as though time itself is reluctant to begin. Martha was the first to notice. She had risen early to rekindle the stove, her breath visible in the kitchen until the fire caught. The house felt oddly hollow, as if someone had left a door ajar. When she reached the hallway, she saw the front door cracked open, snow pressed into its edges, a fine drift curling over the threshold. "Samuel," she called, though she already knew it was not her husband. Her voice traveled up the stairs. No answer. She climbed them two at a time, heart lifting into her throat. Anna was still in bed, half waking, startled by the sound. But Elias's bed was empty. The blanket was folded back neatly, the pillow still carrying the faint indentation of his head. By the time Samuel came in from the barn, Martha was standing at the door with her shawl thrown over her nightdress, staring at the single set of footprints leading away from the house. They were small, deliberate, each one crisp in the untouched snow. "He's gone," she said, her voice thin with disbelief. They followed the trail at once, Samuel striding ahead, Anna and Martha hurrying behind. The air bit at their faces, but the prints were clear, heading straight toward the northern woods. The snow there was deep enough to slow them, yet Elias's steps had not faltered. It was as if he had been walking to meet someone, certain of the path. Within minutes, word had spread. Neighbors emerged, pulling on coats and boots, lanterns swinging from their hands. The search took shape quickly, not out of panic, not yet, but with that grim efficiency born of necessity in rural winters. Voices called Elias's name into the white, their echoes dampened by snow. For nearly a mile, the trail wound through the trees, past the frozen pond, toward a ridge where the wind had swept the drifts low. And then, abruptly, it stopped. The last print was as clear as the first, the heel, the ball of the foot, the toes pointing forward. Beyond it, nothing. No scuff, no slide, no collapse. Just an unbroken expanse of snow, flat and untouched in every direction. The searchers fanned out, boots crunching through the silence, but the snow gave up nothing. No broken branches, no discarded scarf, no sign of struggle. The only thing they found, half buried near the final print, was his sketchbook. It lay open, the wind lifting its pages like a slow breath. The last drawing matched the scene before them almost exactly, the curve of the ridge, the sweep of the snow, the open space beyond. And there, in the center, the small figure walked into the white. In the lower corner, the date stared back at them, January 15, 1875. Anna knelt, her gloved fingers brushing snow from the cover. The pages were cold and stiff, but dry enough to have been carried here intentionally. She turned once, looking out over the untouched snow, the cold burning at her eyes. For a moment, she thought she saw movement far off in the whiteness, not a shape, exactly, but a faint shift, like the air itself bending. Then it was gone. By noon, the search had widened. Men with sled dogs combed the woods. Women brought blankets and hot broth to those returning from the drifts. The pastor stood on the ridge, his breath clouding in the air, murmuring verses under his breath. No one found so much as a thread from Elias's coat. As the light began to fade, the searchers gathered back at the Moore house. The air inside was heavy, thick with the scent of wet wool and wood smoke. Samuel stood by the window, his jaw set tight, watching the snow erase the day's tracks. Martha sat at the table, the sketchbook closed in front of her, both hands resting on it as if to keep it from vanishing as well. No one said the word, gone. In Hartwell, you did not name such things on the day they happened. But in the spaces between their sentences, in the hollow of every pause, the word was there. That night, long after the last lantern had gone dark, Anna lay awake listening to the wind. It had returned, low and even, as though resuming something it had been forced to pause. Somewhere outside, past the edge of the road, past the last place human feet had pressed into snow, the white lay undisturbed. And she could not shake the feeling that her brother was still walking there, moving further into a place where no one could follow. Snow kept falling as if to finish what the day had begun. By morning the ridge where the trail ended had softened under new powder, and the unbroken field looked like a story told by someone who wished to forget. Hartwell did what small towns do when faced with a thing that will not fit their tools. It lowered its voice, closed its doors, and tended the ordinary with unusual fervor. Animals still needed feeding. Firewood had to be cut. The school bell insisted on being rung, because habit resists grief. For 3 days the search continued in shrinking circles. Men who knew every slope and thicket walked as if the land had been rearranged overnight. They checked the pond, breaking ice with poles and peering into black water, lanterns painting weak paths beneath the surface. They walked the fences, crawled under fallen limbs, called Elias's name until it thinned into air. Each evening they returned with faces weathered by a kind of shame, as if their knowledge had failed the valley they claimed to understand. On the 4th day the pastor came to read from the Psalms and to suggest a service for strength, not surrender. Martha nodded and poured tea she did not drink. Samuel stared at the back door as if it were not a door at all but a threshold cut into unanswerable space. When the pastor rose to leave, he placed a thin hand on the sketchbook lying on the table. "These have brought confusion," he said gently, "but they are not the enemy." He did not take the book, he let the house keep it. The schoolhouse changed without declaring itself changed. Children, obedient to habit, took their seats, but their eyes did not settle. Miss Cartwright taught as if working behind glass. On the first day after the search ended she found a page tucked beneath her desk lid, the pond, the trident faint in ice near the far bank. She could not remember when he had left it. She slipped it into her ledger as if hiding something from weather, and teaching became the work of keeping windows closed against looking. In stores and kitchens people tried on explanations to see which might be worn outside. Some said he had fled, boys of 12 had run away to mills and ships before. Others insisted he had fallen into an overhang and been buried, though no collapse was found. A few, their voices low, spoke of a calling, the sort of word that ties the throat in knots when said near a mother. No one spoke with ease. Each sentence felt like a plank laid across a gap to step on quickly and be done. At home ordinary tasks multiplied as if to keep grief from pooling in corners. Anna learned the measurements of silence, the time for water to boil, the interval between logs settling in the stove, the distance she could walk before faces appeared from doorways asking for news she did not have. She listened for the sound of pencil on paper and, when she realized what she was listening for, closed her hands fast, as if to trap the habit before it grew claws she could never cut away. Martha moved through rooms with a softness that made the house seem larger. She spoke less, but her hands were always busy, patching, folding, wiping surfaces that did not need cleaning. In the evening she opened the Bible and placed the sketchbook beside it, as if balance could be restored by symmetry. Once, when the wind leaned long against the walls, she slid the book toward the lamp and turned to the last page, looking at the date as if it were a nail hammered straight through the hours. Samuel's grief was private, easy to recognize and risky to touch. He rose earlier, worked longer, and in the barn spoke to the animals in a gentler tone, as though noise might crack something fragile he held barely in his chest. One night he took the axe and walked to the ridge alone. He returned near dawn with frost in his beard and hands nicked where the handle slipped. He did not say what he had hoped to cut. Anna mended the blisters and did not ask for a reason he could not offer. In the weeks that followed the town practiced careful politeness. People crossed the road rather than passed the moors too closely, not out of cruelty but out of the awkwardness that hovers over those who have seen a map fail. When they did speak, they offered provisions, labor, and advice, but they did not offer questions. Questions opened doors, and everyone had seen where doors could lead. The absence itself became etiquette, a silence observed like Sunday and enforced without any decree at all. When spring finally pushed wet fingers into the fields, the thaw revealed nothing the snow had kept. The pond gave back branches and a lost pail but no coat, no scarf, no bone. The ridge sprouted shy green and the road hardened to mud where wheels could bite. Elias's absence did not shrink. It settled. Anna carried the sketchbook to the attic and wrote, "We looked, in the margin of the first page. Summer followed with softer light and stubborn dreams, and winter began its slow return toward the same white. Stories gathered at the edges of town like drifts that would not melt. A teamster swore he saw a small figure at twilight by the mill stream, a boy-shaped shadow walking where no prince could hold. A widow on the south ridge woke to find the trident traced in frost on her window, though by morning it had softened into fernwork. A child told her mother that Elias visited the schoolyard to borrow a pencil and promised she would not miss it. Such talk stayed off paper and on breath. The pastor and the doctor kept to official words. The ledger showed dates, and the sermons offered comfort like stitching over a wound still bleeding underneath. Yet winter made room for unofficial accounts, multiplying like flakes. People learned to pause in doorways and listen to the white before stepping out, as if the snow might speak if granted the courtesy grief demands. Softly. By the summer of 1875, the story of Elias Moore had already begun to split into versions. In Hartwell, people spoke of him differently depending on who was in the room and whether the shutters were open. In some tellings, he was simply a boy lost in a blizzard, claimed by the same winter that had taken hunters, trappers, and the occasional traveler foolish enough to misread the weather. In others, he had stepped, willingly or otherwise, into something that was not snow at all, though it wore snow's shape. The most practical explanation belonged to Dr. Amos Lyman, who wrote a letter to a colleague in Rutland laying out his theory. Elias, he argued, had been prone to vivid ideation, what modern minds might call an overactive imagination. In the long isolation of Hartwell's winters, the boy had blurred the border between inner vision and outward fact. The date on the drawing? A fixation, perhaps seeded by some overheard phrase, that became a private myth he felt compelled to fulfill. The abrupt end of the trail. Drifts, he reasoned, could cover prints in a matter of minutes if the wind shifted. The sketchbook's position was a puzzle, yes, but not beyond the realm of chance. Pastor Ellsworth offered another reading, one more suited to the pulpit. In a sermon that autumn, he described Elias as a seer unguarded, a boy who had glimpsed too far beyond the veil without the armor of faith to guide him back. God, he said, sometimes allowed such visions as warnings or tests, but the human soul was not built to carry them alone. His voice did not accuse, but it wrapped the mystery in a moral frame. Elias's fate was not random but part of a divine geometry that could not be questioned. Folklorists, though they would not arrive in Hartwell until decades later, would find in his story a perfect fit for older New England tales, the white roads said to appear in storms, leading wanderers into another place, never to return, the belief that certain marks, carved or drawn, could open or close such paths. In this reading, the trident in Elias's sketches was not a signature at all but a kind of key, 3 tines for 3 directions, here, there, and gone. Others, more quietly, reached for a hybrid truth, one in which the boy's gift was real but incomplete. They pointed to the accuracy of certain earlier sketches, the sleigh accident, the broken ice, the chimney fire, and suggested that Elias might have glimpsed events as they would be, only without context. The date on the final page, in that light, was not chosen but revealed, fixed like a star he could not look away from. Anna kept her own counsel. When neighbors, cautiously sympathetic, asked her what she believed, she would say only, "I know what I saw." What she did not say was that her certainty had nothing to do with explanations. It lived instead in the memory of her brother's voice the night before, calm and without fear, as if he were stepping into something known. Martha would not discuss theories at all. She kept the sketchbook in a linen-wrapped bundle in the cedar chest, along with a lock of Elias's hair and the scarf he had worn the winter before. She opened it rarely, but when she did, it was to look at the last page in silence. Once, in late autumn, Anna found her there, fingertips pressed lightly to the date as though it might respond to touch. Samuel's opinion, if he had one, never reached the air. He met speculation with a steady look and a change of subject. Once, in conversation with Amos Pritchard, who was insisting that drifting snow had buried the rest of the prints, Samuel said quietly, "Then why didn't it bury the first ones?" He did not wait for an answer. By the time winter came again, the story had grown comfortable in the mouths of those who told it. The details stayed the same, the footprints, the ridge, the sketchbook, but the meaning shifted to suit the teller. Some favored the safety of accident, others the strange pull of the supernatural. A few carried both possibilities at once, like two coins in the same pocket, each with its own weight. Years later, when Hartwell's population had thinned and the old houses began to sag under the years, the tale of Elias Moore would still be told to children on storm nights. They would be warned not to follow solitary roads in a whiteout, not to linger where the snow seemed to move without wind, and above all, not to draw what they could not yet understand. Whether these cautions were born of reason or something older, no one could say with confidence. What remained beyond dispute was the sketchbook itself. It aged, its pages yellowing, the pencil strokes fading at the edges, but the last drawing held its shape. The figure on the road was still small, still bent against the wind, still walking toward a horizon that refused to appear. And in the corner, the date endured, as sharp as the day it had been written. It was this persistence, this refusal of time to blur certain lines, that kept the story alive. Not because people needed to believe one theory over another, but because the drawing seemed to believe in itself. And in Hartwell, that was reason enough to keep looking over your shoulder when the snow began to fall. The attic kept winter. Even in summer a thin chill clung to the beams, as if a season had been folded and stored there with trunks and hymnals. Duty is grief with a ledger. Her feet found the old stairs without asking what the hands would open. The cedar chest's latch murmured and gave. The sketchbook was smaller than memory, heavier than paper. She opened it. The room obeyed, rearranging itself around the last page the way weather organizes a plane. The date held, January 15, 1875. The graphite had lightened but not yielded. She hovered a finger over the numbers, feeling the warmth in her hand and the refusal in the page. Some lines decay, others keep happening. People had long asked her for an answer. She had learned safe sentences, he left at dawn. The storm was hard. We searched. Truths that could live near other truths without contradiction. What she kept was an image and a sound, a road widening, footsteps that did not pause. Dust turned in the window's bar of light, the slow snow of summer. The past was not behind her but laid thinly over the present, like vellum that shows through wherever a day wears thin. She stood very still and let the pages align. Hartwell had thinned by becoming more itself. A few houses leaned, a few fields furred to alder, the store bell rang to fewer pockets, the church paint peeled its small weather. The wind still traveled the valley with that low, even note that meant winter was practicing. Those who saw it looked away and then kept looking back. She sat at the narrow table and turned leaves. The trident reappeared with modest persistence, inwood grain, cloud seams, the shallow pressure of a path. It was less a key than a notation, here, here, here. If it pointed anywhere, it pointed to persistence itself. A life leaves marks, a boy recorded them, the rest mistook direction for destination. Elias drew what continued whether or not anyone watched. Explanations had long since hung themselves like coats at a door. The doctor's coat said imagination and weather, the pastor said warning and mercy, the town said accident seasoned with wonder. Anna did not argue with coats. Winter needs them. But she recognized that no single garment covers every cold. The drawing did not contradict reason, it stood beside it like a second door. One door opens to daylight, one opens to weather. Neither lies about where it leads. She turned back to the last page and felt, as always, that it was not prediction but record, an account of a thing constantly occurring at the edge of the map. Elias had stepped into that recurrence as simply as into a deeper drift. She remembered his voice the night before, calm to the point of relief, the voice of someone finished with arguing distances. For a long moment she let the silence answer in the room that had stored it. The house settled, a rafter ticked, a moth practiced its small errand. She spoke without intention, keep walking, she said into the attic, and found gentleness in her mouth. "We will be here when the snow lifts." Saying so did not invite or dismiss. It acknowledged the country between. Outside, an iron will rang once on stone and continued. The world had its errands. She wrapped the book again and returned it to linen and cedar, not to bury, but to let it continue walking in the manner objects have. Years ahead, other hands would open the chest, a nephew, rain-bound, a buyer, tallying, a workman, misdirected by rafters. Each would see the same page and feel an old weather press gently forward. Some doors teach by being closed, some stories teach by being exactly themselves whenever found. By then, Hartwell would have fewer names to answer roll and more quiet where disputes had been, but storms would arrive with their impartial arithmetic. Children would still be told not to follow roads that appear where none was. A few on the north edge would admit, softly, to a partner nearly asleep, that on certain nights a small figure moved far out and the urge to speak a name rose and knew better, as names carry poorly across that particular distance. The attic kept winter. The house kept listening. The road kept its trick of arriving from nothing. And the drawing kept walking. The world closes some doors out of kindness and leaves others open out of truth. This was the open kind. The town's lesson, when it had one, was a set of reconciliations. Innocence and darkness share a fence, belief and reason share a table, a loss may be complete and still present. Anna required no agreement. Agreement is another coat, useful while the wind holds steady. She required only care, step gently when the white presses close, leave a lamp at certain windows, remember what paper can hold. It keeps what it is given. So does snow. On her last evening in the house, she paused at the bottom of the attic stairs and listened to the roof accept night's cooling. She did not climb again. Some doors are honored by being left shut. Outside, the first flakes began, reluctant, exact, like speech learning the shape of silence, and the road to the north waited where it always had, pale as breath, patient as a page.